I would like to welcome everyone to the latest edition of the Stern Faculty Insights virtual seminar series on COVID-19. We have some really good stuff coming up, although nothing as good as today's session. For next week on Tuesday, we have Ed Altman talking about COVID and the credit cycle. And then on Friday, John Haidt is going to be joining me to talk about positive psychology and sort of how we can all feel better in this context, what lessons we can learn to feel better in this crisis. But for today, I have the director of Stern's Entertainment, Media, and Technology program, Paul Hardart, who is going to be able to talk to us about what coronavirus means for our entertainment, media, and sports industries. And so welcome, Paul, and in just a reminder to everyone to please go ahead and lodge your questions in the Q&A box. You're welcome to put questions in there even while Paul is talking. And after his presentation is over, I will use those questions. I will put those questions forward to Paul. So thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Well, first of all, Batia, thank you so much for doing all these. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank Rebecca and Rachel and Paula and also Sergio for helping us technologically. I really appreciate it. I also appreciate everybody being here today. I know it's a strange time. So I was just going to go through sort of looking at the pandemic through the lens of entertainment, media, and sports. Obviously, there's a lot of sadness, a lot of tragedy out there. And, you know, I think if there is a silver lining in this, I think it sort of emphasizes, at least for me, how so many of all of us are interconnected, not just in the United States, but globally, and also how a lot of our economy is interconnected and how something happening in one place reverberates across other elements of the economy. And, you know, we're seeing again, which is in a nice way, we're recognizing the value of service workers and hospital and responders. So I think those are sort of some of the things, and also sort of coming up with a solution or a vaccine. It seems to be, you know, a global agenda. And the nice thing to me sometimes about entertainment and media is it is also there's storytelling, sports are global enterprises that get outside of politics. You know, we all were aware this year that Parasite won the Oscar, the first time a foreign language film has won the Oscar. And again, because it was it hit the zeitgeist in an interesting way. And again, as we stream stuff, we start to, we're all of us, I think, are watching things from other parts of the world. So I think maybe coming out of this, there may be some good stuff that comes out of it. To that end, I also think that what we're going to see in entertainment, media, and sports, as well as in other industries, is trends that were happening are maybe just going to be accelerated through this. So the pandemic, to some degree, will serve as an accelerant to seeing things that maybe were already happening. There's a famous Hemingway quote of "How do you go broke? It's gradually, then all at once." And I think we're seeing some of these trends that were sort of gradually happening, and then the pandemic may be the accelerant that makes things happen all at once. This was March 1st. This was the Tokyo Marathon. Again, it seems like a very, very long time ago. It was really the first step they took in terms of, they just had the 200 elite runners. There were no spectators. There was usually about 30,000 people participating in the Tokyo Olympics. Again, that was March 1st. Seems like a long time ago. For context, Mardi Gras, which a lot of people feel was sort of the source of the spreading of the virus, was on February 25th, so just a few days earlier. And I think a lot of you also have heard the story now that because the Chiefs beat the 49ers in the Super Bowl, that maybe averted a lot of spreading of the virus because there was no celebratory parade in San Francisco. Had the 49ers had a celebratory parade on February 5th, that might have also so some of these things that seem unintended kind of connect in interesting ways. When we look at media, I do this with students as well, is the baseline, any kind of media at the end of the day is some form of content. And that can be a movie, that can be a TV series, it can be a book, it can be a magazine, it can be a song, it can be a cat video. It's some piece of content that's trying to find an audience. And then we go, generally, you need a distributor. Obviously, we can all create our content now, but it has to be compelling. So distribution is the way that we reach audiences. And what we're seeing is the organizations or companies that have that direct relationship with the audiences are the ones that are faring well now. Obviously, that would be Netflix, right? They have a direct relationship with its customers. Amazon the same way. Weirdly, you would think a sort of a fabled company like Disney would have those direct relationships, but oddly they don't. Disney, if you go see them, when we went to see movies, if you went to the Union Square Theater and saw a Pixar movie, all Disney really knew, maybe some data, a little bit from the theater companies, was that somebody bought a ticket. They don't know the age, the demographic, or anything else about that individual. Obviously, Facebook, Google, Netflix, all have a lot of information about that. So the companies that did. The other thing you're seeing in terms of the content flow is, if you think about it, we hear a lot about supply chains, being disrupted by the pandemic. Well, the supply chain of content, there is no new production really happening. So there isn't any extra new content coming to feed these distribution apparatuses. And so what you are seeing is the core organizations that have a deep content library. Obviously, those are the sort of legacy studios and places like Amazon and Netflix. What we're also seeing, though, is user-generated content, social media content, people turning to that. It's got an endless supply. I think someone has told me that YouTube has about 48 hours of content uploaded every minute. I mean, it is an unbelievable amount of content. And so a lot of, younger people are turning to social media or TikTok or YouTube or Instagram stories to get their content. This is from yesterday. This is just looking at sort of emphasizing that point I was just making is you can see here the Netflix stock just hit a 52-week high. Disney has been hit pretty hard. If you look at the Disney, and again, Disney is a very diversified global company. However, it's diversified in ways that have been hit directly by the pandemic. Theme parks, cruise lines, movie theaters. No one's going to see movies. Sports, ESPN. I mean, if you think of ESPN, there's, I think, 6 channels of ESPN, 24 hours of sports, and there are no sports. So how do you feed that? And then lastly, you can see that pink line, that is Viacom, and Viacom and CBS were the same company, then split apart, and then just came back together last August. And you can see how that has manifested in there. The amount of value that has been lost with Viacom. Viacom, I think in August when they were coming together, were valued collectively, ballpark, about $30 billion. Today, it's closer to about $12 billion. So you can think about the total value of CBS is effectively evaporated in the last 8 months or so. Now, they also have their direct-to-consumer product that's called Pluto, which is an advertising-based thing. So they may figure out ways to move forward as well. 24 hours a day. We sort of think there's 24 hours a day, and now in the pandemic, who knows? It just seems like maybe one long day we're living in. I don't know. But we all are sort of used to the 24-hour day. And so when you start to think about it, that seems like the outer limit of how much content you could consume. But prior to the pandemic, the sort of thought was we're sort of coming to what was known as peak media. And kind of remarkably is we all collectively were squeezing about 31 hours of activity into a day because we're spending all this time multitasking. 12 hours on average, we were interacting with media and technology, compared to about 7 hours of sleep and just 5 hours of work. And again, we all know that if you walk to an office or a cubicle farm, you'll see lots of people that are on their screens are on social media or something, watching a video that a friend had sent them. I did a chat with students the other day, young, they were 18 or 19 freshmen. And I asked them just sort of more during the pandemic, how much time they were spending on their phone. And they all looked at their phone, you can track it on your phone. The average was 12 hours. This is just phone time. One woman was 18 hours. She was averaging 18 hours a day of just phone time. So that's not including TV or gaming or anything else. So, it is a remarkable amount. And again, these companies, these algorithms are set up to sort of get your attention and hold on to your attention. This is just a chart. I always like this chart as my students see it all the time. It is just sort of a kind of a perceptual map of the various big media enterprises. And it reflects quite a lot of M&A that's gone over the last several years. You have AT&T bought Time Warner, Disney bought Fox, Netflix, Comcast bought Sky, Verizon, had bought Yahoo and AOL. CBS and Viacom came back together. And then sort of on the side there, you see sort of waiting are Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, these sort of behemoths that sort of have put toes in the water but may come in. And I think sometimes, particularly when I talk to students, it's easy to sort of lose track. This sounds like just deal flow and kind of removed from our day-to-day lives. But the truth is, this deal flow really is all about our habits. It's all sort of jockeying for position of how we are going to consume content going forward. We all carry our phones with us, which are, they're not even really phones. They're just computers that we carry with us. There's screens that we have. There was a statistic that Netflix, 12% of Netflix users consume Netflix in public bathrooms, which is a weird statistic, but what it reflects to some degree is that we are taking our entertainment with us. It's portable, we need it, and then the use of data is going to become really important. Also in this sort of jockeying around, you've seen jockeying for executive talent, various companies poaching, there's been lawsuits, and then also for creative talent. So you've heard a lot about, The Office being pulled from Netflix, Friends being pulled from Netflix, then Netflix is poaching Shonda Rhimes and Ryan Murphy. So there's a lot of jockeying for who's going to have that content. And it gets back to that concept of it's distribution and content. Those are going to be the two things that drive the success of these businesses going forward, and scale to some degree. So going back to the idea of acceleration or accelerant of the pandemic, cord cutting, cord meaning people who are cutting the cable cord, has been kind of accelerating over a long period of time. And most reason, the rationale that is given most times that people have cable are for news and sports. You love the Knicks, you love the Green Bay Packers, you love the Giants, whatever your team is. Most people that have cable is for live sports. And that sort of explains why the value of these sports rights are so high, because one, they're live, right? So you're not really going to be inclined to have an ad blocker or watch it time delayed. If you're going to watch a game, you're going to watch it live. Therefore, you're probably going to sit through the ads. So they have your focus. But as there is no sports going on, and cable is expensive, you'll start to see perhaps that this accelerates over time, and more people start to cut the cord. One student of mine was saying she was with her parents and she finally got them to cut the cord. They got YouTube TV, which is a sort of a skinny bundle version of TV. It's much cheaper. It's about $59 compared to cable fees can go up to $100, $200, and you're paying for that monthly fee to carry the box. So we'll probably see cord cutting speed up. And in that, we also might see one of those big companies like an Amazon, an Apple, or even probably not a Netflix, bid on some of these expensive sports rights like the NFL or the NBA. We've also seen over the last several years, movie attendance has plateaued. You'll hear about box office going up. That's really just a function of the ticket price. But the actual people going to the movies has been plateauing for several years and is forecasted, not surprisingly, to drop this coming year. A lot of that is because it's expensive to go to the movies. It's say in New York City, it's about $17 a ticket. You say a family of four, and then you get popcorn and expensive sodas. It becomes a fairly expensive proposition. When you juxtapose that to the alternative where you can sit at home, watch a show, make your own popcorn, and stream it, at your own leisure, stop, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. This is the box office from last weekend, a whopping, $31,000. So people aren't going, the theaters are closed. People aren't going to the movie theaters. You can see these are just all the messages on the marquees. I particularly like the one in the middle here that says, "I assure you we're not open," which I guess there's people coming up and knocking on their door. But heartbreaking because the theater companies were having a hard time anyway. A lot of debt. People weren't going there as frequently as they used to. And so they were having challenges nevertheless. And again, I think the pandemic may accelerate those. Just announced today that AMC got a $500 million credit facility, which will give them a lifeline. And I think Donald Trump also announced today somewhat of a plan of how they're going to start to reopen the economy. And he put movie theaters and elective surgeries in, I think, even schools under the category of phase 2. Sports with fans would be phase 3, but sporting events without fans may also be part of that phase 2 scenario. So when you look at film, the way film makes money over time, and this is sort of expanded over time, was the windowing approach, right? So the idea is you would charge different prices at different times. This is sort of your traditional distribution windows where movies were released in the theater, where you pay the most, right? It's a transactional experience. You go, you pay $16, $17, you get to see it once. Then thereafter, there would be non-theatrical, which is like prisons and military bases, airlines. We've all experienced that. Home entertainment would be like the DVD or the VOD rental. Pay television would be your HBO, Showtime, Epix, network TV, ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and then syndication, where it was sold individually. And that could take 8 years, that cycle. And you could replicate that same thing internationally in every territory. So the deal structure of films can get kind of complex, where you can sell the pay television rights in France and the home entertainment in Germany. Like, you can start to parse things in lots of different ways. But what we've seen over the last years is these windows are starting to collapse, right? So the idea is, it used to be you release a movie theatrically and then you'd re-release it as a whole new product, maybe 12, 18 months later as home entertainment. Those have come much tighter now. And so the idea of waiting, a lot of us will say, I can wait till it's on Netflix, or I can stream it at home. And here's just a representation of that. So you can see how these movies, and again, it's gone over days. So if you look at the average in 2016, you can see it was 3 months, 16 days. 2017, it came down to 3 months, 11 days, which is saved, and then days. And what we're seeing, and this just happened over the last week or so, is that window is being formally punctured. So the theater owners are very, very much have been protecting this theatrical exclusive window. And that's kind of, if you recall, from around the end of last year, the movie The Irishman, the Martin Scorsese movie, was a Netflix movie, was really, it's a 3.5-hour film. It's a famous director, famous actors. Netflix put it in theaters, but none of the big theater chains, AMC and Regal, would carry it because Netflix didn't want to abide by this 3-month window condition. So Netflix was unable to release it in most theaters. So they actually rented out the Belasco Theater here in New York. They also put it in the Paris Theater, which they subsequently did a long-term lease for future projects. And they also did it in California at the Egyptian in Los Angeles. The idea was, Netflix's business model is see it when you want, where you want to see it, how you want to see it, when you want to see it. And the movie theaters are, no, we want an exclusive window. That's the only place you can see it. And now we've seen, just last week, following the pandemic, the James Bond movie was supposed to come out on Easter. And then MGM moved it to Thanksgiving. Universal then had this movie Trolls, a sequel to the first Trolls movie, and they moved it to the Easter weekend. But then as the pandemic sort of deepened, they realized they were just going to release it directly. So last weekend, Universal punctured a formal hole in the theatrical window. So they released this movie Trolls World Tour, reporting it was a record number. Hard to tell because it's not really tracked, but self-reported, it did incredibly well. It's for $19.99. You have 48 hours to watch it once you start it. They also took the movie The Invisible Man and moved it faster into the theatrical window. And it's funny, even in the wording here, you can see in theater rental. Well, it's not actually never in theaters because there aren't any theaters open. And same thing they did with Emma, which is a Focus film, and I Still Believe. And again, like I said, I think you're going to see this acceleration or this faster move into this. So how are people spending their time? Well, they're streaming, right? And I sort of probably is borne out in a lot of our own behavior, right? We're spending more time streaming just even over the last several weeks. And this is to March 15th. You can but imagine as we get a little more comfortable in our home life, we're streaming yet more. And then obviously the subscription growth is growing. And it starts to show you the power of a subscription relationship is. You don't have to sort of draw people's attention to get them to leave their home, go to a theater. It's like basically the deal is We'll give you some good content. You pay us a reasonable amount of money, 9, 10, 15 bucks a month, and we'll just serve you stuff up that you can watch when you want to watch it. And like I said, Disney now is moving aggressively into that direct-to-consumer relationship with Disney Plus. They reported last week they have 50 million subscribers, which is a very big number. Quibi, which is the Jeffrey Katzenberg short-form video content, just came out last Monday. And HBO Max, which is coming out in May, and then Peacock, which is NBC's version of a direct-to-consumer relationship. They were planning on the Olympics to be sort of the galvanizing way to launch that service. Obviously, the Olympics were postponed to next year. So Peacock, again, trying to seize on the people being home, is moving to an earlier date. Right now, if you're a Comcast subscriber, you can get it immediately as of today, or as of this week. Other things we're seeing, we're on Zoom, same thing, virtual classrooms is something that has been talked about for a long time. Now everybody's doing it because the pandemic has accelerated. Same thing with telemedicine, things that people talked about. TikTok is another hugely downloaded thing. And TikTok traditionally has been for teenagers. Even college students weren't doing it, but increasingly that's something that I've had students tell me their mothers are sending them TikTok videos from all over the world. I mean, so the pandemic is changing our behavior and maybe accelerating us towards trends that we might have been embracing over a slower process. News apps have also been downloaded at a very rapid rate. Again, people concerned about what the news is and following that. And then this other trend that we've been seeing, and again, not surprisingly, is this shift towards digital advertising. And the alarming thing is about 75% of all digital or online advertising goes to two companies, either Facebook or Google. Increasingly, Amazon's in that mix. And one of the things that might be a bad outcome here is that some of these smaller players are having troubles, right? Because advertising has taken a hit. And the odd thing in the media world is TV ratings have never been higher, right? Because people are home. But there really isn't any, the CPMs or the cost per thousands to advertise have come down because there aren't any companies really advertising. Automobiles, no one's going to be buying a car, personal products and stuff like that. So the advertising has come way, way down. And therefore, and that's even going to affect the behemoths like Facebook and Google. But what you might see is some of these smaller players not make it through this process, and some of that, the advertising they were getting would accrue to the benefit of these large companies like Facebook and Google. Local newspapers are under siege. That's been happening for a long time. People don't really need it. And compounding that has been the fact that local newspapers oftentimes rely on restaurant ads, live event ads, so there are no live concerts. Obviously, restaurants aren't advertising. And so you're seeing that the pandemic, though people are consuming more news, there's very little advertising. And that's really, and again, going back to my point at the top of the interconnectedness of things, is that restaurants closing, you wouldn't really think would have an impact on newspapers, but that's where their advertising flow is coming from. So this is a sort of a tragic side of it. Ben Smith, who's a media reporter for the New York Times, has argued that we should bail out reporters, but basically let local newspapers go, and let journalists sort of reconfigure themselves in a digital space. So almost sort of concede that the world is moving on without local newspapers, and we should support journalists and how they can sort of flourish maybe online in a new way. This is another trend that we've been seeing, not surprising. There's this vast amount of data that being collected by companies, and that's but accelerating, and that's going to be an important part. Same thing for companies like Disney. Like I said, they don't really have that much data. As they start to move to the direct consumer with Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, they're going to have more data. They're going to be able to sort of target ads more effectively, and also ideally understand what the consumer habits are and consumers' desires are. 5G is rapidly coming online. And again, the main benefit for 5G is also going to sort of improve the home viewing experience, and also for things like gaming or your driverless cars, is it removes that problem of latency, right? If you're a gamer and you're, trying to sort of do some process online, you don't want to have the little spinning thing. Same thing, obviously, in driverless cars. You want to be clear that if that thing in front of you is a bus or a human being, you want to understand it. So latency will be one of the big advantages of 5G. And so this is just a survey of asking sports fans of when they think things will go back. Not a lot of people think it's going to be in this summer. It's starting to seem, like I said, we just got a report this morning of a Donald Trump sort of plan to open the government again or open the economy. But a lot of people are saying they don't know, and it's going to be after December, which is going to have a huge impact on sports. So how does sports sort of focus on this going forward? Well, ESPN last weekend did a rebroadcast of the Masters from last year, but they did it sort of live with Tiger Woods going through every one of his shots. If you're a golf fan, that's fairly compelling because he's talking about it was an inherently exciting Masters, but you can only do that so often. So they're rebroadcasting old classic games. They're now playing horse, which I don't know if you watch it. It was pretty terrible. It didn't really work. So but you have to give them credit. They're experimenting. Same thing with the late night talk shows or news journalists or reporting from home. And I think you will start to see new ways of doing reporting, new ways of providing entertainment. And so there's different ways of experimenting with. But God bless, ESPN. They've got 24 hours to fill on 6 channels. So horse seemed like as good enough an answer as possible. In Taiwan, they're putting robots in the stands to sort of, and they're also a lot of talk of maybe creating like a bubble where only the athletes will play. Keep in mind that the real revenue generator of most sports is the broadcast and the media rights. So though you want fans there to sort of increase the excitement of it, and that is a lot of money, being able to sort of have stuff that you can broadcast will be important for sports going forward. There's also the trend of eSports, right, which has been growing on a rapid basis. eSports, if you're not familiar with it, is watching other people play sports. So you're on Twitch and you're watching other people play video games. So Fortnite and I sort of, when I first heard about it, I thought it was sort of insane. But the truth is, it's a skill, just like putting a ball in a hoop is a skill, or hitting a little, white ball down a grassy, green. So it's a skill. They're very good at it, and they're fans. And if you're a millennial, you're really into it, more so than other traditional sports. So again, if you start to think of the acceleration, people are home. They have time. There's no other sports to sort of defray their attention. And as 5G comes on, esports will get even sort of more interactive. So it does seem, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, there's even colleges now giving esports scholarships. There are franchises being sold. So again, we are in a new world of this. So where do we go from here? There's no clear way we're going. Like I said, Trump has come out with his recommended plan. Here's Zeke Emanuel's, who's a doctor, a bioethicist, and his prediction is that, it's going to take a long time before you're going to start having conferences, concerts, and sporting events again, because I think most people are going to be a little leery of going to a place where there's a lot of people. The main reason I also use Zeke Emanuel is he's well known as a bioethicist. He's fairly outspoken. He was involved in the Obamacare initiative, but he's also the brother of Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, and more notably, Ari Emanuel, the head of the William Morris Endeavor. William Morris Endeavor planned to go public last year. Their IPO was scheduled the day after Peloton went public. Peloton's underwhelmed in terms of its IPO, so the William Morris Endeavor IPO was pulled. They have a lot of debt. And again, I think this is more of a reflection of a lot of these media companies, as the companies with a lot of debt are in somewhat of trouble. WME is a obviously large talent agency owning William Morris, but they also own IMG, the huge sports agency that they bought. They also own Ultimate Fighting Championship, which is, live sporting events, and also pro bull riding, so professional bull riding. So Zeke Emanuel's comments sort of go right against his brother's own interests as well in this. So it gets somewhat interesting in that regard. But I guess the main takeaway, and again, there's no right answer, is humans have been creating art, telling stories, sharing news, creating music for, we learned only recently that the Neanderthals were creating art. That's 1.8 million years ago. So the need for storytelling, music, entertainment is not going away. That is a human thing. And it is a nice thing about the pandemic in that we can start sharing stories, maybe at home, and we're experiencing stories from around the world. But to me, that's not likely changing. There's just going to be new ways of doing it. And it seems like the companies that have that direct consumer relationship in a decent enough library of content may be able to succeed this. And the last thing I'll just show you, and again, this is maybe a little too metaphorical, but I remember being at a national park a few years ago, and the park ranger talked about how there's these kind of strange plants that the seeds are only released at extreme heat of a fire. So when there's a forest fire, that's the only way their seeds are released. They're in these cones that have resin, and that they need the extreme heat to release the resin. So the point being, and stuck in a metaphor, would be that this is a, what's it called, a lodgepole, is that there is this pandemic, and a lot of the trends that were happening are accelerating, and we're going into this new world. But I do think there are going to be new businesses or new seeds that are launched, new ways of telling stories or communicating or sharing things, whether that's TikTok, whether that's eSports, or some of these legacy things that have been around as they pivot to sort of our new habits. But those are my main comments. Obviously, we could go on and on about this because it touches our lives in all sorts of ways, but I'd love to hear your questions. But again, Batia, thank you for your time on this.
Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions. You touch on so many different things, but one industry that you didn't address directly was music, and there's a lot of money in the live music performances. So that seems like something that's going to be that's certainly under threat in the short term. Do you see any changes in the music industry, or do you think that they're going to be buffered from the impact of this crisis?
No, not buffered at all. I mean, you make a good point. I should have brought that up. So music has changed over the years. For a long time, the way the music business worked is you could make your money through publishing. You could make your money through sort of selling the recording rights. And then lastly was live. And live was the purview of the artist. That changed somewhat recently, where the other rights got a little less remunerative. And so they moved into this world called 360 deals, where all those rights. And so live is become a really important part of most musicians' lives, and things like Spotify are generally ways of spurring awareness. Most artists will tell you they don't make a lot of money unless you're a superstar. And the challenge is, and this is true throughout the media space, is when we think of music, we oftentimes think of the very famous artists. But the truth is, for most artists and most journeyman artists that are working, these live performances is how they make their money. And so when some of these big events are canceled, it becomes really painful. So it is not removed from it. The artists that, again, I think going back to the pivot, is a lot of these musicians are coming up ways of fostering or deepening that direct relationship with their fans, using things like TikTok and Instagram to figure out ways to relate to them. But it is a huge impact on most musicians, as where most of their money today is coming from, particularly outside of the superstars, is from live performances. So it is a huge impact, and that's a good question. So I guess one person asked here about the idea of how this changes expectations for over-the-top launches during the pandemic. Quibi, Peacock, and their life cycles are going to be drastically different compared to past launches. The challenge, and again, I think you all can hear me, the challenge for a lot of these over-the-top services that are launching is even Disney Plus. I have Disney Plus. I also got Quibi, is what's known as churn, is that we're going to get it, and then we're going to watch it, engage with it, and then get rid of it at that moment. So the challenge is going to be for things like Quibi. They don't have a very deep bench of content. There's no new content they can feed that in. So I got Disney Plus through Verizon. So I have 1 year. And the question is, I don't really use it. I don't see the utility in it. So that's going to be the challenge for a lot of these companies, HBO Max, of the churn of people getting it, getting the introductory free trial, and then watching it, and then getting something else. And let's see what else here. What if Miss Dr. Emanuel and sports with crowds is not ready until September 2021? That's a good question. That's from Linda Luca. It's a huge question. And I think, a lot of sports teams and leagues are looking into ways that they can get the season going. It may be different, same thing with social distancing, or they've even talked about having Major League Baseball start in Arizona with all the players and testing the players. But none of it is as easy as it sounds, like having them almost in like a little bubble biosphere where they would just play and almost for our entertainment. But it's complicated because there's 9 players on a baseball team at any one time. There's huge staff, there's filming crews. They're all going to go home. And so it does get complicated and how that will actually practically work. Here's another question from Megan, who's an MBA student. Is given that movie theater business was already in decline, do you think it will survive the pandemic? Great question. Like I said before, a lot of these movie companies are saddled with quite a bit of debt, and the trend wasn't going in their favor. And they've triggered out ways, same thing with like these other companies, to have direct relationships. So AMC having a subscription basis, a subscription relationship. Going forward, I think you are going to keep seeing movies. And this was predicted a long time ago by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, that movies may start to be something that you do on a less frequent basis, but for more money. So you may go, maybe more like a Broadway show where you pay $85 to go see Avatar 2, and it's an outing, it's a whole experience, versus going to see, some rom-com that you might have, you could just watch as easily at home.
So do you anticipate that the crisis is going to lead to changes in pairings? You touched on the new launches. And so whether there would be some M&A activity as a function of this. And I guess Scott Galloway apparently was recommending that there might be some devalued sports-oriented franchises. And do you see that as an opportunity, et cetera?
Yeah, so companies that have a strong balance sheet at this time, and a lot of those FANG companies do. And there's been talk for years that should they go buy a studio to get into this, I'm not sure they need a studio. I mean, if you think of what a studio does, it pays for content, and that is something that is a function of money. But there has been a lot of talk saying Apple should go buy Disney, because Disney is at a lower price right now. They have been whipsawed more than most companies by this pandemic. So maybe that's an opportunity for them to be acquired by another company. I'm not sure I see how they fit. I'm not sure these large tech companies necessarily needed. And if you look at AT&T bought Time Warner, AT&T's stock is down by about 25% since then. Even large hedge fund Elliott went in and bought, as an activist investor, bought a large percentage, about $4 billion worth of AT&T. So sometimes this merging technology and content hasn't really worked, we think famously about AOL Time Warner. So there may be an opportunity, but it also may be a, like Dido for Aeneas. It may not be the thing that's good for them ultimately, but I think there will be interest, and there certainly will people keep kicking the tires, but I'm not sure it ultimately will make sense.
Do you see changes in kind of organizational life cycles and growth patterns for different sectors of the industry? Do you think, for example, that coronavirus, did you discuss sort of the possibility that coronavirus will create much more rapid growth in the segments of these OTT organizations that you touched on, QB and Peacock and stuff like that, and maybe others that will fail because of the timing?
Yeah, I think there is, I mentioned briefly, is the challenge for a lot of these companies is this concept of churn. And for some strange reason, you talk in business school a lot about the first mover advantage. And sometimes the first mover advantage is you become the canary in the coal mine and you tip over, and another company comes in and does what you were unable to do effectively. That sort of happened with MoviePass and AMC. But in this case, Netflix has such a huge, and Netflix has been aggressively spending on content and growing internationally, and it's a strange thing that most people, I feel, have Netflix as almost like a baseline, almost like electricity in their home. And then all these other services are a little more like a variable cost. So I think the challenge is going to be churn. And clearly, as we've seen unemployment spiking at a remarkable level and the economic sort of headwinds for all of us is, the idea of taking on a new service, even if it's $4.99 a month, is going to be a hard thing to justify of why are we spending money on something new or trying something new. We might try it to see a show. At the end of the day, it's still relatively a cheap form of entertainment, but HBO Max is going to have challenges because they have to be priced at around a $14.99 price point. So it might be a good opportunity for something like Peacock. Peacock, which I had mentioned, is going to sort of accelerate its launch. That is a AVOD or an advertising supported product. So you might start seeing people like, I'll get rid of cable and now I can still watch some of these shows I love from NBC. And the commitment I'm paying with my time, I'm paying with by watching advertising. And that may be a reasonable value proposition. Yeah. If that makes sense.
It looks like there are a bunch of questions that are related to kind of how is this changing Hollywood, and both from sort of scripted content, reality television. Do you see there being changes in any of those things? Do you see it coming back, and when? I wonder if you could comment on sort of what are the implications of this for Hollywood? Obviously, right now, as you said, there's nothing happening there.
Yeah, well, the action you are seeing is animation is they're still delivering shows in animation because you do not need, animators can work from home. Voice actors can, are setting up little studios in their closets. So we probably are going to see a large amount of animation sometime. The interesting thing is there's going to, like I talked about, that sort of supply chain. There is going to be no new content for a while, and therefore there's going to be a cliff that we sort of fall off of and need to fill that void. And this happened years ago. Sort of the advent of reality TV was born out of the writer's strike of people coming and like, all right, we have to figure out if we can do this cheaply. We can just film people in their homes and call it, and make it dramatic. So I think you might see sort of new formats of storytelling happening. The other thing that we have seen, and I think it reflects some on the sporting world too, is that I think the star culture is, the people that we really tune in to see a famous person. That list is getting shorter and shorter. I think we're all watching shows now that are about the concept, whether it's Tiger King or it's, some other show on Netflix or Amazon or Hulu that is not driven by the star, but it's driven by the concept. And the other thing that we've seen happen with that shift over the tops kind of programming is, there is a lot of creators want to go to a Netflix or an Amazon because they're not constrained by the format. They can curse, they can have maybe more violent or sexual instances, and also they're not constrained by the format. An episode can be 46 minutes one week, 53 minutes the next week, 104. Whereas on TV, it's 22 minutes for a half hour, 44 for an hour. You have to have commercial breaks in there. So there has to be sort of plot points that are going to keep the audience's attention. So that freedom to tell stories in a new way or in a longer form where, there's, and again, this is where the definition of content gets kind of nebulous, where we are used to thinking of a movie as something you see in the theater, it's about 2 hours long. And we're used to thinking of a TV show as something that is serialized and it's either a half hour, an hour. And increasingly, you could say Game of Thrones is a 70-hour movie, and Fast and the Furious there's 9 of those, it's an 18-hour movie. And it's all just content and it's all just different ways of telling stories. And I think that sort of has freed the creative class in a really interesting way. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more. John Krasinski has launched a YouTube show, which has been incredibly popular. And he just, it's John Krasinski at his home trying and getting huge following from that. So, I think there are going to be opportunities to start selling things in new ways.
Yeah, what you're just now talking about is kind of highlighting that there might have been some holes. There might have been some demand or, some flexibility that we wanted and we didn't have before, and that that there might be opportunities to kind of fill those needs now. And Emily Glazer poses a really interesting question on whether you think there are other holes or gaps in the industries that aren't being addressed, and how we might be able, are there things that are there opportunities for new firms to walk in and address them?
Well, definitely. And, the interesting thing, like I sort of was saying before, and I've said this to my students too, is the barriers to entry to create content have come way, way down. We can all make a video. We're making content here to some degree. You can make a movie. You can write a song at home relatively cheaply. The challenge is that distribution element, right? Of, we can make a song and we can distribute it to the world. We can make a movie, distribute it to the world, but there's so much other content out there. So there's cutting through is the hard part. So what is it going to be that helps you cut through? And, we're seeing that with TikTok. That's effectively a new form of content. And there are TikTok stars being born out of nowhere. A friend of mine's daughter does TikTok videos of horror makeup, and she has a huge following. Now, she didn't embark on that. So I think there are new things, and I think the market, that's a nice thing about sort of the global access that we have with these platforms, is the market sort of speaks for itself and things respond. And a lot of people have said that the appeal of something like TikTok vis-a-vis Quibi is TikTok is stars are sort of coming from the bottom up, whereas the thesis behind Quibi is it's expensive premium content and we're going to push it to you. And I think sometimes that discovery is lacking in that regard.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
We got a bunch, so many good questions. One of them that is an industry you didn't really touch on that comes from Dolly Chug is a question about what do you think it means for the book publishing industry? Well,
really good question. So for a lot of Kindle books and stuff, they've actually been going up quite a bit over the last, and increasingly, so I think there is an increase in reading. People are home more. The challenge, though, too, is that everybody's attention, we are so, our attention is so atomized, so focusing on books is hard. So the book industry, I think, has plateaued in a fairly solid way. It's still, going strong. And increasingly with some of these things, some of these celebrities, whether it's Reese Witherspoon or Oprah famously, promoting various forms of books, promoting reading, that's buoying it a lot. And then also because there's such a demand for content, there will be a greater demand for content. A lot of these books are being adapted into Netflix series, and again, that's going back to the format thing is, things that may not have ever turned into something, books are turning into a four-part series on Netflix or Amazon. And then that increases the awareness of that book in a dramatic way. People buy the book more, and then they get more aware of the author, and they may read other things by that author, and it goes down this road of discovery. But a very good question.
So one of the things that entertainment, media, and sports all really touches on is that they are so essential to our culture. They kind of shape the culture, they reflect the culture, and obviously there are a lot of things that are changing. For example, with sort of not being able to gather together, sort of sporting events in some ways are like what you were talking about with the 49ers. They represent the city, they represent kind of the group of people. And I wonder if you see changes in our culture as a function of changes in the industry and the practice of entertainment, media, and sports, or either way, either direction.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like in any business, most things that we consume or participate in are habits, right? And again, that's why businesses always want you to get trial, right? They want you to try their shaving cream or their shampoo, like it, and then make it part of your routine. The longer we all stay in this sort of isolation or quarantine, our habits will slowly start to change. And the thought of going back to a movie theater might, every day that goes by that we don't do that and we consume things, that habit may get more ingrained. And so I think what you are seeing, again, here we are on a Zoom call. I think we've all, I think joked with friends that I'm doing Zoom, party cocktails or whatever you want to call it with people I don't socialize with in normal life, so that's a new thing. And you can start to see that, getting more ingrained. And you're seeing that in the entertainment space of, again, a lot of this sort of celebrities or people using various formats to create content and responding to it. There's a thing on Twitter of someone who evaluates people based on their backgrounds, of what their backgrounds, like what their homes look like. And then again, that's a whole new thing that didn't exist, even a week ago. So I think we are going to see all sorts of new ways. There's concerts being held on Zoom, there's concerts being held on TikTok. And so I think you're going to start seeing those things. And the longer we do this, the more people, because the great thing about entertainment and media is it's a creative outlet for a lot of really creative people, and they will find a way to express themselves and get it out there. And then if it's good, it'll bubble up to us, and maybe that'll be a new form of way we consume things.
It looks like we've got a bunch of questions that relate to podcasts perhaps being kind of an opportunity. I don't know if you have any sort of quick thoughts on podcasts.
Well, weirdly, and again, sort of not, counterintuitively, but the podcast listening has actually gone down during the pandemic, because I think it was something people would do on an isolated basis, in transit, right, on their way to work or doing something solo, running. So podcast listening has actually decreased somewhat during the pandemic. The one thing that's interesting about podcasts that has become new, and again, we may see new ways of doing this, is a lot of TV and film studios have, there's the concept of development, right? You read a script, or you make a pilot of a TV show. Increasingly, they're saying, make a podcast. That will be the very cheap version of development. And then if it works there, then we may adopt it into a pilot, then we'll adopt it into a series. So it's sort of becoming the lower cost first cut at development. But podcasting has gone down. But again, a lot of podcasts have since been adapted into series. And so I think a lot of these companies, sort of keeping their development costs low, have turned to podcasting as a way of sort of that's the first round of development, is make it. And if it's good and the story's there, then we'll use that as the framework to turn it into a show or a series.
So you were kind of sounding the death knell for local newspapers. That was probably the one place that you were kind of highlighting, hey, this industry may not kind of survive. And I wonder if many people had been talking about that even before. I wonder if you see any other industries. We know that there are a number of other industries in the entertainment arena that have been that were already on the rocks before this, things like opera and classical music. And the question is Broadway theaters, as you mentioned, where there's, but live theater in general, which, it feels like has hit some challenges for now decades. What do you see any industries not surviving this, or surviving in a ghost of their original form?
Well, again, I hate to be the one, because I'm a newspaper reader. I worked at a newspaper. So I don't want to in any way declare the death knell, but I do think they are not in a good position. They have large fixed costs. So, and I do think the need for local news is essential. And therefore, I think, sort of kind of echoing what Ben Smith's review was, I think it's the journalists. And there's now a local news version of the Peace Corps. You can effectively go, they'll pay you to go be a journalist in a small town. So I think it's an essential, important part of our, basically our democracy. The challenge is the monetization of it. And this has sort of been something too that bigger newspapers have also had to deal with, is where do you put the public service versus the business, right? So a lot of them have been lowering their paywall related to the coronavirus, but at the same time, they're like, all right, demand is up and now we're giving it away for free. They have to reconcile that public service. But I do think local newspapers probably may not sort of make it through this, or may reconstitute themselves in a new way, and that may be online or other ways of getting that, or being a part of a larger news organization. I think magazines are also in a huge challenge. I think magazines, again, great revenue, great business model where there was two revenue streams, subscription and advertising, but both of those, most people aren't willing to pay for, aside from things like the New Yorker, most magazine, the business has been really hurt and advertising is hurt. So the two key revenue streams have been sort of whipsawed. And the other challenge with that is, and I think some of these things, like if you think of People magazine or Us magazine, a lot of people would get that so they could have some, they could see the celebrities that they love, photos of them. But increasingly, the celebrities are, again, having that direct relationship. They're taking pictures or videos of themselves in their home far better than a paparazzi was able to take, of them coming out of a restaurant. So I think you are going to see the magazine business, and some of them have tried to pivot into a digital world, but it's that subscription model that's a hard thing. I've said this before. I think particularly in economically hard times, people are going to look at their credit card and go through all their subscriptions and then start making decisions of, I have a lot of subscriptions. Do I need all of these? And then you start getting into the decisions of which ones they're going to cut and keep.
Right. So we're right up against 1 o'clock. So just a quick thought. There were several questions that we're looking at whether this is going to make things more divisive internationally, the way that our media has tended to divide us in some ways. Social media has tended to divide us in some ways. Do you see that accelerating or attenuating now going forward?
That's a good question. Obviously, the media is a big part of sort of driving some of these stories, particularly in the news realm. I'd like to hope that, like I've said at the beginning, I do think we are, even if you're in New York City and you lean out the window at 7 p.m. and clap or hit a pot, I do feel like, the pandemic is a human thing. It's not a political thing. The virus is not a Republican or a Democrat so I'd like to think that the more we try to solve the pandemic on a global basis, and the more that we start to consume content from other parts of the world, from other cultures, that there will be more empathy. I might be naive in that. Fox News, still generates the highest ratings in cable television. So, there is a fair amount of polarization, and I think, I think most people, I think the gray area, particularly in the United States, in terms of like Republican, Democrat, there's about 5% that's ever going to go opposite of what that party, their already established party is. So you'd like to think that there was some chance of that, but I do think a lot of people move in. Finally, we talk about sort of data, the big data, that leads us to that echo chamber of, feeding the algorithms, feeding stuff that sort of feed our own opinions. And that's the other problem with this. And so I think that's a place that we could maybe explore, of opening ourselves up to other viewpoints. And I think I would encourage everybody to, whether you like Fox or you like MSNBC or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, is read both, because I think that's the only way that there's going to be some sort of maybe, sort of mellowing of that political sort of conflict.
That's great advice for us to end on. Thank you so much, Paul. There were a ton of other questions that we couldn't really reflect on. We'll get that sent to you and see if there are ways of getting the word out.
Batia, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. Thanks. Have a good and stay safe. Good weekend. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.